Imagine being told that the deadliest men in the American West relied on the pristine, factory-standard revolvers you see sitting behind velvet ropes in modern museum display cases. Believing that the immaculate, polished steel and perfectly checkered wooden grips were the ultimate, unquestionable tools of frontier survival. But the men who actually lived through the blood-soaked, smoke-filled reality of 19th century violence understood that a factory-issued firearm was nothing more than a crude starting point, a blank mechanical canvas that had to be ruthlessly modified, aggressively filed down, and completely altered to give them the microscopic, fractional advantage needed to survive a point-blank assassination attempt in a dark alleyway. The professional killers, the elite bounty hunters, and the hardened lawmen engaged in a secret, undocumented underground arms race of weapon modification, willingly voiding warranties and completely stripping away essential safety mechanisms to create highly customized, terrifyingly unpredictable instruments of death that were uniquely tailored to their exact physiological needs and their own personal brand of violence. But before we rip the hammers off these modified mechanical beasts and explore the dark, incredibly dangerous art of frontier gunsmithing, I need to know exactly who is standing on the firing line with us today. So pause this video right now and drop your city and state down in the comments below so we can map out our global battalion of history hounds and see exactly where our squad is holding the line against the modern noise today. Because we are about to dive into the raw, unvarnished history of how desperate men manipulated heavy machinery to cheat death, starting with a mechanical alteration so incredibly dangerous and counterintuitive that it completely terrified casual gun owners. Yet it became the absolute hallmark of the most feared close-quarters assassins in the world. I am talking about the deliberate, intentional removal of the trigger mechanism entirely. A radical modification known as creating a slip gun. Hollywood westerns constantly show actors effortlessly fanning the hammers of their pristine Colt single-action army revolvers, slapping the metal with their palms while holding the trigger down to achieve rapid fire. But the mechanical reality of doing this with a standard factory weapon is a mathematical disaster waiting to happen. The internal timing of a factory Colt relies on a delicate balance of springs and sears, and violently fanning a standard gun will almost immediately break the fragile internal bolt, causing the massive steel cylinder to over-rotate and fire completely out of alignment with the barrel, resulting in a catastrophic detonation that will instantly blow the top strap of the revolver completely off and send lethal shrapnel directly into the shooter's eyes. To circumvent this fatal engineering flaw and achieve true, blistering speed, professional gunfighters like the legendary John Wesley Hardin would take the revolvers to underground gunsmiths who would systematically rebuild the entire internal architecture of the weapon, installing massive, reinforced mainsprings and completely removing the trigger and the delicate locking sears, leaving nothing but a smooth, empty trigger guard. They would then physically lower and widen the spur of the hammer, heating the steel and bending it downward so it rested perfectly under the thumb. To fire a slip gun, the operator did not pull a trigger. They simply drew the weapon, pulled the heavy hammer back with their thumb, and literally let it slip off their skin, relying entirely on the brutal tension of the reinforced mainspring to slam the firing pin into the primer. This terrifying modification essentially turned a complex mechanical device into a crude, hyper-efficient, spring-loaded catapult, completely eliminating the physiological delay of a trigger pull and allowing a hardened killer to dump 6 heavy-caliber rounds into a target in the literal blink of an eye, provided they had the absolute ironclad nerve to carry a fully loaded, triggerless bomb strapped to their hip every single day. But the extreme modifications of the Wild West were not just limited to the internal clockwork of revolvers. They extended to the absolute apocalyptic devastation of close-quarters artillery, leading to the creation of one of the most infamous and terrifying customized weapons to ever exist on the frontier. The weapon famously deployed by the highly educated, terminally ill dentist turned ruthless gunslinger, Doc Holliday. They laughed when they saw Holliday, a man slowly dying of tuberculosis, a frail shadow of a man who looked like a strong gust of wind could knock him over, walking toward the fateful confrontation at the OK Corral in Tombstone, completely unaware of the devastating mechanical surprise he was hiding beneath the heavy canvas of his long, gray overcoat. Holliday was a man of logic and mathematics, and he understood that his physical frailty made a prolonged, drawn-out shootout with heavy handguns a massive biological liability. So he required a weapon that would end the engagement instantly, with absolute, overwhelming, undeniable finality. He did not carry a standard rifle. He carried a massively customized, sawed-off 10-gauge double-barrel shotgun, a weapon that had been ruthlessly amputated by a hacksaw, chopping the long steel barrels down to a mere fraction of their original length, completely destroying its range, but transforming it into the ultimate concealable room-clearing device. The ballistics of a sawn-off 10-gauge are simply incomprehensible. By removing the choke and the length of the barrel, the massive cloud of heavy lead buckshot begins to aggressively spread the exact millisecond it clears the muzzle, creating an inescapable, expanding wall of flying lead that requires absolutely zero precision aiming. To manage the horrific, bone-breaking recoil of a weapon that essentially functioned as a handheld cannon, Holliday famously attached a custom leather sling to the modified shotgun, wearing it tightly against his body underneath his coat, allowing him to absorb the massive kinetic shock with his entire torso, rather than his weakened, trembling arms. When the shooting finally erupted in that dusty, freezing alleyway, Holliday simply threw open his overcoat, swung the amputated 10-gauge up on its leather tether, and unleashed a literal, localized hurricane of lead that instantly obliterated Tom McLaury, proving with brutal, mathematical certainty that the most dangerous weapon in a gunfight is not the one with the longest barrel or the shiniest finish, but the one that has been ruthlessly customized to exploit the exact, terrifying parameters of close-quarters survival. And this relentless pursuit of customized, mechanical advantage did not stop at the firearms themselves, because the most terrifying assassins of the era understood that the ultimate modification was not just increasing your own lethality, but fundamentally altering your own biological vulnerability to incoming fire, leading to the chilling, heavily armored reality of a man known as Jim Killer Miller. They were told that the only defense in a gunfight was a fast draw and the sheer, blind luck of avoiding the enemy's lead. But Miller, a devout, teetotaling churchgoer who secretly operated as one of the most prolific and ruthless contract killers in the state of Texas, refused to leave his survival up to chance or divine intervention. Miller recognized that the mathematics of a prolonged shootout heavily favored the man who could simply absorb a direct hit without flinching. So he completely revolutionized the concept of frontier defense by secretly sewing a massive, heavy plate of solid steel directly into the lining of his long black frock coat, effectively creating a 19th century version of covert ballistic body armor. The sheer psychological terror of encountering Jim Miller in a firefight was absolute, as perfectly demonstrated during his legendary confrontation with Sheriff George Frazier. When the two men finally clashed, Frazier, a highly skilled lawman, drew his lever-action Winchester rifle and fired a massive, heavy-caliber slug directly into Miller's chest at point-blank range, a shot that should have mathematically resulted in instant, catastrophic organ failure and certain death. The kinetic energy of the rifle round hit Miller with the force of a sledgehammer, knocking him backward, but instead of falling into the dirt, the ruthless assassin simply absorbed the horrific impact, the heavy lead slug flattening uselessly against the hidden steel plate ringing underneath his coat. Imagine the absolute, paralyzing horror that gripped Sheriff Frazier as he watched a man he had just shot dead center simply stand back up, completely unfazed, slowly leveling his own shotgun to deliver a devastating, fatal counterattack. Miller had essentially turned himself into a walking, mechanized tank, utilizing the raw metallurgical strength of an industrial steel plate to completely override the established laws of frontier ballistics, proving that the most terrifying modifications of the Wild West were the ones that completely shattered the expectations of the enemy, turning a guaranteed lethal strike into nothing more than a bruised rib and a deafening metallic clang. This was the true, unvarnished reality of the professional frontier gunfighter, a world where factory specifications were completely meaningless, and survival was entirely dictated by your willingness to chop, file, armor, and ruthlessly manipulate the physical world around you to ensure that when the black powder smoke finally cleared, you were the only one left standing with a heartbeat. They laughed when the well-dressed, highly educated men from the East Coast began arriving in the chaotic, mud-soaked boomtowns of the frontier, wearing tailored suits and bowler hats instead of dusty canvas dusters and wide-brimmed sombreros, completely oblivious to the fact that these quiet, corporate enforcers were carrying a localized, mechanical apocalypse hidden inside their tailored wool pockets. We are talking about the legendary operatives of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency and the specialized, highly engineered weapons they carried to enforce corporate law in a lawless land. Because these men understood that in the claustrophobic confines of a luxury train car or a crowded high-stakes gambling parlor, pulling a massive 14-inch Colt single-action army from a leather belt holster was a mathematical impossibility that would get you killed before the muzzle even cleared your hip. The Pinkertons required a weapon that completely eliminated the mechanical liabilities of the standard revolver. A weapon that could not snag on the thick fabric of a winter coat, that could be drawn in an absolute fraction of a second, and most importantly, that could be fired repeatedly from entirely inside a pocket, without ever exposing the weapon to the enemy. Enter the absolute mechanical genius of the Smith & Wesson Safety Hammerless, a top-break, double-action revolver that completely revolutionized the concept of concealed carry and urban frontier warfare, famously earning the moniker of the lemon squeezer. To the casual observer, the most striking feature of this revolutionary piece of hardware was the complete and total absence of a visible hammer, because Smith & Wesson had entirely enclosed the firing mechanism inside the solid steel frame of the weapon, creating an incredibly smooth, snag-free profile that looked almost alien compared to the jagged, heavy machinery carried by traditional cowboys. This enclosed hammer design meant that a Pinkerton detective could literally walk up to a hardened outlaw sitting at a poker table, keep his hand resting casually inside the pocket of his overcoat, and mathematically eliminate the threat by firing all 5 .38 caliber centerfire cartridges directly through the wool fabric of his own clothing, completely bypassing the agonizingly slow draw stroke and the vulnerability of an exposed hammer catching on the lining of his suit. But the sheer, terrifying brilliance of the lemon squeezer did not stop at its enclosed hammer, because the engineers at Smith & Wesson understood that a double-action pocket pistol carried in a highly stressful, chaotic environment was a massive liability if the operator accidentally pulled the trigger while grappling with a suspect. So they invented one of the first reliable grip safeties in the history of firearms. Built directly into the backstrap of the handle was a spring-loaded steel lever that physically blocked the firing mechanism from engaging unless it was firmly and intentionally depressed by the web of the shooter's hand, meaning that the weapon could be dropped, kicked, or violently wrestled over without ever catastrophically discharging into the detective's own leg. Yet it was instantly and seamlessly ready to fire the exact millisecond the operator established a firm firing grip. The psychological advantage of this snag-free, continuously firing pocket artillery was absolute, because the outlaws, who had spent their entire lives mathematically calculating the distance and time it took for a lawman to clear leather, were suddenly facing a terrifying new breed of enforcer, who could simply point his finger from inside his coat and unleash a deafening, invisible wall of lead that tore through fabric, flesh, and bone without warning. They were told that the lever-action repeating rifle was the absolute, undisputed king of the frontier arms race, a mechanical throne held tightly by the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. But the brutal reality of a prolonged, chaotic firefight in a burning barn or a canyon ambush dictated that even the legendary Winchester had a terrifying biological limit based entirely on the geometry of the human arm. When you operate a traditional lever-action rifle, the physical mechanics require you to drop your firing hand away from the trigger, aggressively push the steel loop downward and forward, and then pull it back to chamber the next round, an incredibly violent motion that inevitably forces the muzzle of the rifle to drop, completely destroying your sight picture and requiring you to completely reacquire your target after every single shot. In the blinding, smoke-filled terror of a frontier gunfight, those precious fractions of a second spent bringing the sights back onto a moving target were mathematically fatal, prompting the engineers at Colt to aggressively challenge Winchester's dominance by introducing a weapon so blisteringly fast and mechanically intuitive that it completely terrified traditional riflemen. I'm talking about the Colt Lightning slide-action rifle, one of the very first highly successful pump-action rifles deployed in the American West. A weapon that fundamentally altered the savage arithmetic of volume fire by completely eliminating the awkward, downward stroke of the lever. With the Colt Lightning, the operator's firing hand never left the trigger, completely maintaining a rock-solid, unbreakable grip on the stock of the weapon, while the non-firing hand simply utilized a natural human, horizontal pumping motion to pull the wooden fore-end backward and violently shove it forward, ejecting the spent brass and chambering a fresh, heavy-caliber cartridge in one fluid, continuous stroke. The mechanical efficiency of this pump-action design was so mathematically superior that a skilled gunfighter could easily cycle and fire the Lightning twice as fast as a man operating a lever-action Winchester, allowing a lone defender to completely saturate an enemy position with a continuous, deafening barrage of .44 caliber lead, while mathematically keeping the heavy iron sights perfectly glued to the target the entire time. Imagine the absolute kinetic horror of an outlaw gang attempting to rush a stagecoach station, fully expecting the lone guard inside to fire a shot, drop his rifle to cycle the lever, and give them a 2-second window of vulnerability to cross the open ground, only to be met by the deafening bean, machine gun-like stutter of a Colt Lightning dumping its entire 15-round tubular magazine into their ranks, with absolutely zero hesitation or break in the sight picture. But this blistering, unparalleled mechanical speed came with a terrifying, often fatal drawback, because the internal clockwork required to translate that horizontal pumping motion into the vertical lifting of a cartridge was incredibly delicate and highly susceptible to the brutal, adrenaline-fueled panic of a life-or-death struggle. In the chaotic terror of a close-quarters ambush, a terrified operator would frequently short-stroke the slide, meaning they pulled the pump back just far enough to extract the empty casing, but pushed it forward before the lifter could fully position the next round, resulting in a catastrophic, horrifying double feed, where two massive cartridges wedged themselves violently into the intricate steel mechanism, completely locking the entire weapon solid. When a Colt Lightning jammed in the middle of a gunfight, it did not just malfunction. It turned itself into a completely useless, hopelessly complex block of bound steel that required tools and time to dismantle, a luxury that simply did not exist when a hardened killer with a drawn revolver was rapidly closing the distance to your position. This was the terrifying dichotomy of the frontier arms race, a constant, blood-soaked gamble where men eagerly traded absolute, unbreakable reliability for the intoxicating, devastating advantage of overwhelming mechanical speed, fully understanding that if the intricate 19th century clockwork failed, their lives would instantly transition from a calculated mathematical shootout into a brutal, horrifying, biological struggle for survival. And when those delicate springs finally snapped, when the black powder fouled the cylinders, and when the heavy steel chambers clicked completely empty in the dark, the men who truly survived the absolute worst the frontier had to offer did not reach for another complicated machine. They reached for a weapon of pure, unadulterated, primal violence that required zero maintenance, suffered zero mechanical failures, and delivered an incomprehensible level of catastrophic bodily destruction. They laughed when they saw a man carrying a massive, heavy-bladed knife on his belt in an era dominated by repeating firearms, assuming it was nothing more than a crude camping tool meant for skinning deer or cutting rope. But the true apex predators of the gambling halls and the muddy streets knew that the legendary Bowie knife was not a tool. It was a highly specialized, scientifically engineered instrument of close-quarters butchery, designed specifically for the exact moment the gunfight devolved into a grapple. The Hollywood Westerns love to show men running out of bullets and engaging in polite, cinematic fistfights, trading clean punches in the center of the saloon. But the gritty, horrifying reality of an empty gun in the 19th century meant that a man was instantly going to draw 9 inches of razor-sharp, heavy carbon steel and attempt to physically dismantle your biological structure. The true historical Bowie knife was a masterpiece of lethal geometry, featuring a massive, thick steel spine that could absorb the impact of parrying a heavy cavalry saber, and an iconic, terrifying clip point that was mathematically designed to align the razor-sharp tip perfectly with the center axis of the handle, ensuring that a desperate thrust would effortlessly punch straight through the heavy boiled wool of a winter coat, shatter the ribs, and instantly penetrate the vital organs. But the most crucial and brilliant engineering feature of the Frontier Bowie was the massive, heavy brass crossguard that separated the blade from the handle, a feature completely absent from standard hunting knives. This heavy guard was not designed to protect the user's hand from slipping forward. It was specifically mechanically engineered to catch, trap, and bind the sliding blade of an opponent's knife during a violent, point-blank struggle in the pitch black of an alleyway, allowing a skilled fighter to lock the enemy's weapon and deliver a catastrophic, limb-severing counterstrike. The psychological terror of facing a man who has just discarded his jammed revolver and drawn a heavy Bowie knife is simply incomprehensible. Because you are no longer fighting the cold, detached mechanics of a firearm, you are instantly plunged into the horrific, visceral reality of biological warfare, where the smell of black powder is replaced by the terrifying wet sound of heavy steel separating muscle from bone, proving once and for all that the true conquerors of the American West were the men who were fully prepared to abandon their advanced machinery and embrace the savage, absolute brutality of the blade when the mathematics of survival demanded it. Imagine being told that the legendary era of the horseback outlaw, the great train robbers, and the wild frontier simply faded away into the sunset because of polite civilization, expanding telegraph lines, and the gradual establishment of local law enforcement, when the absolute, terrifying truth is that the age of the Wild West was violently, ruthlessly extinguished by a chemical revolution that completely eliminated the blinding, suffocating fog of war. For decades, every single gunfight on the American frontier was a chaotic, localized weather event of thick, choking white smoke. Because traditional black powder burns incredibly dirty, meaning that after the first 2 or 3 shots in a saloon or a canyon ambush, the air would become an impenetrable, sulfurous cloud, instantly blinding the shooter and immediately giving away his exact position to everyone within a mile. But in 1894, the Winchester Repeating Arms Company introduced a mechanical and chemical apocalypse to the frontier in the form of the Winchester Model 1894 lever-action rifle, chambered in the revolutionary 30-30 Winchester centerfire cartridge, the very first commercial sporting round to utilize smokeless powder. The introduction of nitrocellulose-based smokeless powder fundamentally and permanently altered the terrifying mathematics of survival. Because it allowed a projectile to be pushed at unprecedented supersonic velocities while producing almost zero visible smoke when the weapon was discharged. Imagine the absolute, paralyzing horror of being a seasoned cattle rustler pinned down behind a rocky outcropping, listening to the deafening, supersonic crack of bullets passing inches from your head, watching your men drop to the dirt, and having absolutely no idea where the fire is coming from. With a black powder rifle, a sniper was forced to reveal his location with a massive plume of white smoke every single time he pulled the trigger, giving the enemy a clear, defined target to return fire upon. But with the smokeless 30-30, a skilled marksman could sit on a timber ridge 300 yards away, completely camouflaged by the brush, and systematically dismantle an entire gang without ever exposing his physical location. The 30-30 projectile traveled with such flat, laser-like trajectory and carried such devastating kinetic energy that it induced massive hydrostatic shock, instantly dropping horses and men with a level of brutal efficiency that made the old heavy-caliber black powder rifles look mathematically obsolete. But the relentless evolution of 19th century ballistics faced a massive, terrifying engineering hurdle. Because the traditional tubular magazines found on Winchester lever-action rifles stacked the cartridges end to end, meaning the tip of one bullet rested directly against the sensitive, explosive primer of the cartridge in front of it. This design was perfectly safe for the flat-nosed, slow-moving lead bullets of the black powder era. But the new, highly aerodynamic, pointed Spitzer bullets required for maximum supersonic range acted like literal firing pins inside the magazine tube, meaning the heavy recoil of firing the rifle could easily cause a catastrophic chain detonation, blowing the entire magazine to pieces and instantly amputating the shooter's left hand. To solve this terrifying mathematical liability, an absolute mechanical genius named Arthur Savage engineered the Savage Model 1899, a lever-action rifle that completely discarded the dangerous tubular magazine and replaced it with a brilliantly complex internal brass rotary spool hidden directly inside the steel receiver of the weapon. This rotary magazine separated the cartridges individually, allowing frontiersmen to safely load and fire modern, pointed, high-velocity ammunition that carried its devastating kinetic payload over staggering distances, completely bypassing the aerodynamic limitations of the Winchester rifles. The Savage 99 was the bleeding edge of industrial combat technology, even featuring an incredibly advanced mechanical counter, a tiny brass window drilled into the side of the receiver with numbered engravings that physically rotated to show the operator exactly how many rounds they had left in the heat of a chaotic firefight, completely eliminating the terrifying uncertainty of a dry click in the dark. It was the weapon of choice for the ultimate, absolute apex predators of the deep wilderness. Men who required a machine that delivered sniper-grade accuracy, flawless reliability, and the devastating, flat shooting power necessary to drop a massive elk or a desperate fugitive across a sweeping, wind-blown canyon. But as the outlaws adapted to these high-velocity rifles, the corporate barons, the mining conglomerates, and the heavily funded detective agencies realized that they needed an even more terrifying, overwhelming solution to protect their gold shipments and break the massive, violent labor strikes that were turning the late frontier into a localized war zone. They did not just want to outshoot their enemies. They wanted to mathematically ensure that resistance was biologically impossible, leading to the deployment of the very first fully automatic, gas-operated machine gun in the history of the world. Designed by the undisputed god of firearms, John Moses Browning. I am talking about the Colt-Browning Model 1895, famously and terrifyingly known as the potato digger, an air-cooled, belt-fed monstrosity that completely removed human muscle from the reloading equation. Unlike the earlier Gatling guns, which required a terrified, adrenaline-fueled operator to manually crank a heavy handle to rotate the barrels, the potato digger operated on the pure, violent thermodynamics of the expanding gunpowder gases. Browning engineered a heavy steel flapper arm mounted on a hinge directly underneath the barrel. When a cartridge detonated, a tiny port tapped the high-pressure gas, violently throwing the heavy steel arm downward and backward in a massive, sweeping arc. This violent mechanical stroke instantly unlocked the breech, extracted the spent brass, pulled a fresh cartridge from the canvas belt, and slammed it into the chamber, firing the weapon at a blistering, deafening rate of 400 rounds per minute, completely automatically, as long as the operator held the trigger down. The sheer, apocalyptic terror of facing this mechanized slaughter was incomprehensible to men who had grown up carrying six-shooters. Because a single corporate enforcer, mounted behind a potato digger on a fortified train car, could project a continuous, flip, unbreakable wall of lead that could literally saw a wooden barricade in half, flip, shred a galloping horse to pieces, flip, and mathematically suppress an entire army of outlaws. It earned its infamous nickname because the heavy, reciprocating steel arm swung down with such violent force that if the operator set the tripod too low to the ground, the mechanical flapper would physically dig into the dirt, violently kicking up rocks and dust, while raining a continuous storm of empty brass casings onto the soil. The introduction of gas-operated machine guns and smokeless powder marked the absolute, undeniable death of the romanticized Wild West, replacing the myth of the lone, honorable gunfighter with the cold, industrialized, terrifying reality of mechanized corporate warfare. The most brilliant, chilling demonstration of this brutal transition occurred in 1902, during the epic, blood-soaked manhunt for Harry Tracy, widely considered the last great outlaw of the American frontier. Tracy was a hardened, ruthless killer who broke out of the Oregon State Penitentiary using smuggled Winchester 1894 rifles, embarking on a staggering 2-month-long running gun battle across 2 states, while being relentlessly pursued by massive posses, bloodhounds, and even units of the state militia. Tracy completely understood the new, terrifying mathematics of smokeless powder, and he used his .30-30 Winchester to wage a brilliant, physics-defying war of attrition against hundreds of men. Because his ammunition produced no smoke, Tracy would set up overlapping ambushes in the dense timber, allowing the massive posses to walk directly into his kill zone before opening fire, instantly dropping deputies and sheriffs with surgical, high-velocity headshots from hundreds of yards away, completely destroying the morale of his pursuers, who found themselves taking heavy casualties from an invisible, phantom shooter. He mathematically dismantled the overwhelming numerical superiority of the lawmen by utilizing the flat trajectory and the absolute invisibility of modern ballistics, turning the deep woods of the Pacific Northwest into a terrifying, lethal chessboard, where every single mistake was paid for in blood. It was not a cinematic showdown at high noon. It was a cold, calculated, military-grade sniper operation conducted by a desperate man who realized that the frontier he once knew had been completely paved over by the unstoppable, grinding gears of industrial progress. When Tracy was finally cornered in a wheat field in Washington, bleeding heavily from a severed artery in his leg, completely surrounded by a massive posse armed with modern rifles, he did not surrender to the new world, and he did not wait for the inevitable hail of bullets. He simply utilized the cold, flawless mechanics of his own weapon to mathematically end the equation on his own terms, leaving behind a legacy that served as the final, violent punctuation mark on the era of the outlaw. We look back at these incredible, terrifying pieces of machinery today, at the invisible death of the .30-30, the brilliant rotary spool of the Savage 99, and the mechanized, dim and digging violence of the Colt machine gun. And we realize that the men who survived this era were not operating on luck. They were operating on the bleeding edge of thermodynamics, metallurgy, and kinetic physics. These rusted, silent artifacts are the physical, ironclad proof that the world was not built by polite agreements, but by the relentless, ruthless application of mechanical leverage in the face of absolute, terrifying darkness. Yet, the modern digital algorithms, the sterile, sanitized systems that control our feeds and dictate our history, are actively working to bury these gritty, unvarnished truths beneath an endless, pacifying wave of meaningless noise, hoping that we will simply forget the raw, sulfurous heritage of the men who bled into the dirt to build this reality. They want to erase the mathematical genius of these weapons, replacing the terrifying roar of history with a polite, fictionalized fairy tale, written by people who have never had to trust their life to a piece of machined steel. So if you understand the absolute, vital importance of preserving these monolithic stories of mechanical survival, if you still feel the massive, kinetic echo of that history in your chest, then you must weaponize this algorithm right now. You must crush the like button, share this transmission with every true history hound in your network, and prove to the digital overlords that we will not allow the iron and the blood of our ancestors to fade into the abyss of forgotten content. I need you to go down into the comment section right now and prove that you are a permanent part of the global battalion that still respects the engineering, the grit, and the absolute truth by typing the exact words, "We hold the line." Let them look down at the comments section and see our unbreakable formation, standing strong against the grain, waiting for the next order.